The Methodist Conference was scheduled to meet on site in Birmingham this year. Unfortunately, the continuing impact of the pandemic meant that quite late in the day, plans needed to be changed, and from it being a mainly on-site event, it became a mainly Zoom event, and all of the Yorkshire North and East team attended the conference on Zoom. That has an impact clearly on the fellowship and sharing and a lot of those informal relationships that one builds at conference. It's a great pity that for the second year we needed to be constrained in that way. There was a big agenda, some of it carried over from the previous year. There was a lot to do, and yet with its usual grace, the conference rose to that challenge and worked hard over the time. It was good for us as a district team to be able to meet together eventually as restrictions further eased for a meal and just to look back on the conference experience. And I'm grateful now for Emma and Sandra and Alistair and Eileen and Rory, who are going to share with us some of their reflections from this year's conference. Thank you.
Everyone, it was my first time at conference this year, and the parts that really stuck with me was the President and Vice President's addresses that focused on a place for all, the theme for this coming year. President Sonia Hicks talked about how when her great aunt first came to England, she tried to go to a Methodist church ready with her membership card, but ultimately was told, your sort don't go here, or go to the other church. And I think this was really good at showing we have made great strides in the church at being more welcoming and open, but I like the fact she didn't shy away from the reality that this still goes on when she talked about her own experiences of feeling actually being sidelined, or sometimes that maybe she was being too sensitive or maybe hadn't understood a joke. And I feel that completely resonated with me as having a multiracial family. I think these are often things that come up, and I think it's really important that we strive to make everything more welcoming. I felt this was mirrored really well in the Vice President's address by Barbara Easton. She brought a big quilt to the front that she'd made and talked about how when she first started quilt making, she would make it the way she liked it. So she would make colours, patterns that she enjoyed. But she came to realise when talking to her teacher and looking on it that actually it was better to do some bits to other people's liking and not just have it the way she envisioned it. And actually, like, diversity helped it. A quote from her address was, "A limited perspective yields to a disappointing quilt." I feel both these addresses really formed the idea well of what a place for all is and why it's needed in a Methodist church. And I really hope they continue to have an impact this coming year.
This was my second time at conference, and it wasn't quite as daunting as the first time round. Being a conference rep is a huge privilege and responsibility, one I take very seriously. There was a wealth of reading matter, but I knew to start preparing much earlier this year, and as a result, felt more able to contribute. In fact, I wrote to the contacts of the Strategy for Justice, Dignity and Solidarity report before conference began, seeking clarification that the boundaries mentioned in the report, and which are not clearly defined, would include the conscience clause for ministers who find themselves unable to officiate at same-sex marriages. There are lots of things I could mention, but I've decided to concentrate on the theology of safeguarding. Lots of people I meet seem to be scared of that word theology, or think it's a waste of time. In my opinion, their fears are unfounded. Theology is very important. As the report itself points out, theology shapes contexts, both contexts which enable abuse to happen and contexts which enable human flourishing. Safeguarding is the work and responsibility of all members of the Church. It's an intrinsic part of our participation in God's mission, and one way in which we demonstrate our care for each other and for all whom we encounter. Our recognition of God's desire for human flourishing has to be accompanied by a recognition of the reality of the human condition, the depths of what people are capable of, and the potential of us all to cause damage and to abuse trust and power. Conference directs church councils, local preachers' meetings, circuit meetings, and so on, to consider the implications of the report for their work and practice. I'm really pleased it's on today's agenda. Just last week I happened upon a quote by Colin Morris, a somewhat controversial Methodist minister who died in 2018. He said, "Your theology is what you are when the talking stops and the action starts." So let's engage with this report wholeheartedly and then do all we can to promote and safeguard the welfare of all. Thanks for listening.
In these few moments, I'd like to share some thoughts on two subjects: God in Love Unites Us and the strategy for justice, dignity and solidarity. And to introduce that, I want to use an expression that the president of the conference, Sonia Hicks, used. When you grow, I don't shrink. The Methodist Church's position on marriage and relationships has grown to recognise that for many years we've held a variety of understandings, sometimes contradictory understandings. God in Love Unites Us did not intend to debate those differences. They're well established. It did, however, recognise that our theological reflection on these matters has led us to a variety of views. Instead, we were invited to answer a more simple question. Can we make space for the views sincerely held that differ from our own? And Conference's answer to that was, yes, we should. The traditional understanding of marriage as between one man and one woman is still there, and no one is forced to change their understanding. But there are many who have held a more inclusive view. For the first time, those who have understood marriage not to be dependent on gender have also had space made for them in our theology and polity. And so a second understanding of marriage as being between two people has been accepted. Both definitions of marriage are within our constitutional practice and discipline. Churches and ministers are free to hold to either definition as their conscience allows. There's no enforced change. What Conference stated clearly was that all relationships, the quality of relationship, the quality of good relating, is the thing that is at the heart of our understanding. The strategy for justice, dignity and solidarity recognises our need for what the Vice President, Dr. Barbara Easton, called artheosis, a restoration of the divine image in all humanity. Justice, our common humanity. Dignity, our divine community. Solidarity, our humble solidarity with all others. The strategy is long overdue and recognises our need to take practical steps to address the discrimination and exclusion that people face. Importantly, this is about dealing with systemic issues. In other words, things like how we do business. These systemic issues that favour a white, non-disabled, straight male tradition of ministry and governance. But it isn't about doing more, doing a tick box, lots of extra work. It's about our mindset. It's about changing how we do what we do to be inclusive of those marginalised and excluded. We're invited to consider questions like, who's not in the room when we make decisions? And why is that? It's about ensuring that we listen intentionally for people's voices and stories. When they grow, we don't shrink.
One of the resolutions passed by conference was to raise the minimum size of a local church to 12 members from 6. This is of great significance to not only 1 or 2 chapels in my circuit, but for many throughout the district. First and foremost, it is important to say that this does not mean the connection is trying to close smaller places of worship. I would rather say it's the opposite, in that it is trying to free members up to serve the Lord through mission and evangelism without having the weight of the responsibility to manage the trusteeship of their property. There are 3 choices for the members. First of all, they can close, but like I've said, no one wants that to happen. Secondly, 3 or 4 smaller chapels come together to form a new group and work together as one, and yet still keep their own chapel open. For example, this new group of 3 or 4 chapels would have 1 treasurer, 1 secretary, 1 property steward, 1 safeguarding officer, and so on, instead of each chapel trying to find these positions themselves. They can still worship in their own building and maintain their own identity. Preachers might not be appointed every week, so there may be more group services. However, each chapel can choose to do a local arrangement if they so wish. And then the third option would be for a smaller chapel to become a class of a bigger church. The bigger church would become the managing trustees, although the smaller chapel members would continue doing the work. For example, the treasurer would take the money on a Sunday and then pass it on to the treasurer of the bigger church, who would oversee it as part of the bigger church's finances. There would normally be a separate record so that the smaller chapels knows how much money they have for mission and repairs and so on. The smaller chapel can have a representative on the church council. By opting for this choice, it means the bigger church does make decisions for the smaller chapel class. The situation is reviewed annually, and if a class has sudden revival and the number of members grows up to 18 or so, they can become an independent church again.
Hello everyone, Rory Dalglish, York Circuit, and a first year returner to conference, having been away from conference for some time, serving on Methodist Council and doing other connectional things, but it was good to be back as part of the district team. It was a significant and momentous conference. We made wide-ranging decisions and had wide-ranging conversations on things that really matter, that others will talk about or have talked about already in these short video presentations. I guess I'd want to briefly say that the bigger picture for me of the conversations we had was shaped by a change in culture that I hope we can embrace locally as fast as possible, if we haven't already. We aren't a big church. We aren't a big organisation. We're a quite small organisation nationally, behaving as though it's a large organisation, and also quite conservatively. And I just mean by that we are perhaps overly cautious and careful about what we have inherited and what we think we should do with that. Case in point, the fact of the connectional treasurer saying to us that the £300 million sitting in the Central Finance Board in local church pots has been largely untouched during the pandemic. And I wonder, with others, as conference did in a number of conversations about what the future looks like, what that says about, not that we're comfortable, but that we are needing to discover what it means to be small, what it means to be nimble, what it means to be bold, what it means to take risks, what it means to perhaps think less about the legacy we've inherited and rather much more about the legacy we intend to leave. One of the things that was true at conference is that we scratched our heads a lot about what that would look like and what that meant. And of course there's much learning to do and lots of conversation, lots of joy and heartache for us as we go forward. But we are a church that is changing not just in our numbers, but changing in our picture of ourselves. And that conference wrestled with that as much as we will wrestle with that at synods, in local church contexts and circuits and at other places. So let's do that well as we think about what shape the church takes in the years going forward.